Hello, and welcome to The Essential Reads. My name is Isaac, and my goal is to bring to you a bunch of classic audiobooks in an easy and accessible way. We are continuing with The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka today, as it is a short story, and short stories are on Fridays. It's still bloody long. It's like 70 pages. It's not a short story. It's a novella, which is supposed to be a short story, but there's a difference. And if you like books, you know there's a difference. But let's continue before I get wrapped up in that sort of thing, and continue to answer the question of whether Franz Kafka would still hate his existence and have a troubled relationship with his father, were he a bug. The answer again is yes. Support the show, do all the things, let's begin. Dusk was falling when Gregor woke up from his deep, almost comatose sleep. He would surely have woken up not long afterwards, even if he had not been disturbed, for he felt that he had slept long enough and was sufficiently rested. But it seemed to him that he had been wakened by the sound of light footsteps and the cautious shutting of the door leading into the hall. The light from the electric street lamps shone faintly here and there on the ceiling and on the upper parts of the furniture. But down, where Gregor was, it was dark. Moving slowly and awkwardly, with the help of his feelers, which he was only now beginning to appreciate, he pushed himself forwards towards the door to see what was going on out there. His left side felt like one long, unpleasantly tight scar, and he was forced to hobble on his 2 rows of legs. Moreover, one of his legs had been injured during the events of that morning. It was almost miraculous that only one had been hurt, and trailed lifelessly behind him. Only when he reached the door did he realize what had really enticed him there. It had been the smell of food, for there stood a bowl of full, sweetened milk, with small slices of white bread soaked in it. He could have laughed with delight, for he was even hungrier than he had been earlier that morning, and he immediately dipped his head almost up to his eyes in the milk. But he quickly drew it out again in disappointment. Not simply because the soreness on his left side made eating difficult for him, and he could only eat if his whole body made a strenuous effort to cooperate, but also because this milk, normally his favourite food, which was certainly why his sister had placed it there, was not at all to his taste. In fact, he turned away from the bowl almost in disgust and crawled back into the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor could see through the gap in the door, the gas was lit. But whereas at this time of day his father usually read out loud from the afternoon paper to his mother, and sometimes to his sister too, no sound could be heard now. Perhaps these readings, which his sister had spoken and written to him about, had recently been suspended anyway. But there was silence all around, although the apartment was certainly not empty. "What a very quiet life my family leads," said Gregor to himself as he started out in the darkness with a feeling of great pride that he had been able to provide such a life and such a fine apartment for his family and his sister. But what if all this peace, all this prosperity, and all this happiness should now end horribly? Rather than dwell on such thoughts, Gregor preferred to move about, and crawled up and down in his room. Once, during that long evening, one side of the doors, then the other, was opened just a small crack, and quickly closed again. Someone evidently wanted to come in, but then had second thoughts. So Gregor stopped right next to the door to the living room, determined to tempt the reluctant visitor in somehow, or at least to find out who it was. But this time, the door was not opened again, and he waited in vain. And now that he had unlocked one door, and the others had been opened in the course of the day, no one came, and moreover, the keys were on the other side of the door. It was late into the night before the light of the living room was turned out, and now it was easy to tell that his parents and his sister had stayed up till then, because he clearly heard all 3 of them leaving on tiptoe. Now it was certain that no one would come into Gregor's room until morning, so he had plenty of time without being disturbed to think about how he was going to reorganize his life. But the high, spacious room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor intimidated him, though he could not think why. After all, he had lived in it for 5 years. And turning, half instinctively, and feeling a little sheepish, he scuttered under the sofa, where, although his back was rather squashed and he could not raise his head, he immediately felt comfortable. His only regret being that his body was too wide to fit right underneath. There he remained the whole night, which he spent partially half asleep, constantly being jerked awake by pangs of hunger, but partially in a state of anxiety and vague hopes, which all led to the conclusion that he must, for the time being, remain calm and exercised the greatest patience and consideration to allow his family to cope with the inconvenience he was forced to inflict on them in his present condition. Early the next morning, it was still quite dark, Gregor soon had occasion to put these resolutions to the test, for his sister, almost fully dressed, opened the door from the hallway and looked in nervously. She did not see him at first, but when she noticed him under the sofa, good heavens, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown away. She was so startled that she could not control herself and slammed the door shut from the other side. But then, as if regretting her behaviour, she immediately opened the door again and came in on tiptoe, as if she were visiting someone who was seriously ill, or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head out to the very edge of the sofa and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk, though certainly not because he wasn't hungry? And would she bring him in other food, more suitable for him? If she didn't do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to it, even though he actually felt an overwhelming urge to dash out from under the sofa, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something decent to eat. But his sister, wondering, immediately noticed that the bowl of milk was still full, and that only a little milk had been spilled round about. She quickly picked it up, though with a rag rather than her bare hands, and took it out. Gregor was most curious to know what she would bring instead. He imagined all kinds of different possibilities. But he could never have guessed what his sister, in her kindness, actually did. In order to test his appetite, she brought him a wide selection, all spread out on old newspaper. There were old, half-rotting vegetables, bones from last night's supper in some congealed white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, cheese that 2 days before Gregor had pronounced inedible, a slice of dry bread, a slice of buttered bread, and a slice of bread with butter and salt. In addition to all this, she also put down the bowl that was probably now intended once and for all for Gregor's use, which she had filled with water. Tactfully, for she knew he would not eat in front of her, she left quickly and even locked the door, just for him to know that he could make himself as comfortable as he wished. Gregor's little legs wriggled as he came out to eat. Moreover, his injuries must have healed completely now. He no longer felt restricted. This amazed him, as he remembered how more than a month ago he had cut his finger slightly with a knife, and how this wound had still hurt badly enough just the day before yesterday. Could it be that I am less sensitive now? He thought, already nibbling greedily at the cheese, which of all the food had instantly appealed to him the most. One after the other, his eyes watering with satisfaction, he quickly devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. But he disliked the fresh food. He simply could not bear the smell of it, and even dragged the things he wanted to eat a little further away. He had long since eaten his fill, and was now lying lazily in the same place when his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a sign that he should move back. This startled him, although he was almost asleep, and he scurried back under the sofa. But for even the short time his sister was in the room, it cost him a great effort to stay under the sofa, because he had eaten so much that his body had become rather swollen, and he could hardly breathe in the confined space there. Between brief bouts of suffocation, he watched with protruding eyes as his unsuspecting sister swept up with a broom both the remains of his meal and the food he had not touched, as if this too was no longer of any use. Threw everything hurriedly into a pail, which he covered with a wooden lid, and took it all outside. Scarcely had she turned to go than Gregor pulled himself out from under the sofa, stretching himself and taking deep breaths. In this way, Gregor was now fed every day, once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and again after everyone had finished lunch, when his parents again slept for a while, and his sister sent the maid out on some errand. For sure, they did not want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps they could not have put up with knowing any more about his meals than his sister told them. Or perhaps she wanted to spare them even the slightest degree of grief, for indeed they were already suffering enough. What excuses they had used to get rid of the doctor and the locksmith on that morning, Gregor could never find out. For since they could not understand him, no one, not even his sister, imagined that he could understand them. And so, whenever his sister was in his room, he had to be content just with listening to her occasional sighs and appeals to the saints. Only later, when she began to get used to everything, there was of course no question of her becoming fully accustomed to the situation, Gregor sometimes overheard a well-meant remark, or one that could be understood as such. "Well, he enjoyed his food today," she would say whenever he had laid into it with gusto. While if the opposite happened, which gradually became more frequent, she would say almost sadly, "Now he's left it all again." Although Gregor was not able to hear any news directly, he learnt some things from the neighbouring rooms. And whenever he heard voices, he would run straight over to that door and press his whole body up against it. For the first few days especially, there was no conversation that was not about him in one way or another, if only in private. For 2 days, at every mealtime, the family discussed how they should deal with the situation. But even between meals, they talked about the same thing, for there were always at least 2 of them at home, no doubt because no one wanted to be there alone. And on no account did they want to leave the apartment empty. Moreover, on the very first day, the housemaid, it was not entirely clear what and how much she knew about what had happened, had begged Gregor's mother on her knees to let her give her notice immediately. And when she left a quarter of an hour later, she wept as she thanked them for letting her go, as if it had been the kindest thing they had done for her, and though no one had asked her to, solemnly swore that she would not divulge the slightest thing to anyone. So now his sister had to help his mother with the cooking too, but this did not give her much trouble, for they ate almost nothing. Again and again, Gregor heard one of them vainly urging the others to eat.
To eat, mother.
But the only answer was, "No thank you, I've had enough," or something of the sort. Perhaps they didn't have anything to drink either. His sister frequently asked her father if he would like some beer, saying she would gradually fetch it herself. And when he did not reply, to overcome his reluctance, she would say she could send the caretaker's wife for it. But then her father would finally give her an apathetic "no." And that was the end of it. On the first day, Gregor's father had already explained the family's whole financial situation and their prospects to his wife and daughter. And now and again, he stood up from the table and took some certificate or account book from the little strongbox that he had kept when his own business collapsed 5 years earlier. He could be heard opening the complicated lock and closing it again after taking out the document he was looking for. These explanations of his father's were in some way the first cheering news Gregor had heard since his confinement. He believed that his father had been left with nothing at all from his business. At least he had told him nothing to the contrary. But then Gregor had not asked him about it either. Gregor's sole concern at the time had been to do everything he could to enable his family to get over the collapse of the business, which had reduced them all to a state of complete despair as quickly as possible. So he had then begun to work with a particular zeal, and almost overnight had advanced from junior clerk to travelling salesman, which of course gave him much more scope to earn money. His successes in this work, in terms of commission, were instantly converted into cash, which could be laid out on the table at home in front of his surprised and delighted family. Those had been good times, and they never returned. At least, not as splendidly as then, though Gregor had later earned so much money that he was in a position to meet all the family's expenses, which he did. They'd simply got used to it, both he and the family. They took the money gratefully, he provided it gladly, but that special warmth was missing. Only his sister had remained close to Gregor, and because unlike him she loved music, and could play the violin with great feeling, he had a secret plan to send her to the conservatoire the following year, regardless of the great expense it would inevitably involve, which he was confident could be met by other means. During Gregor's brief stays at home, the conservatoire would often be mentioned in his conversations with his sister, but always only as a beautiful dream they could never hope to realize, and his parents were unwilling to listen even to these innocent remarks. But Gregor had definite ideas about it, and intended to announce it with great ceremony on Christmas Eve. Such thoughts, quite pointless in his present condition, went through Gregor's head as he stood upright, clinging to the door and listened. Sometimes he was so overcome with exhaustion that he could no longer listen, and inadvertently let his head bump into the door, but then immediately held it still, for even the slight noise he made would be heard next door, and they would fall silent. "Whatever is he up to now?" his father would say after a while, obviously turning towards the door, and then the interrupted conversation would gradually be resumed. Since his father tended to repeat himself frequently while he set out the family's financial situation, partly because it was a long time since he had gone into it himself, and partly because his mother did not always understand everything at first, Gregor now learned clearly enough that in spite of all their misfortune, there were still some funds, though not a great deal, left from the old days, and that they had grown a little in the meantime with interest, which had not been touched. Moreover, the money which Gregor had brought home every month, he only kept a modest amount for himself, had not all been used up, and had accumulated into a small lump sum. Behind his door, Gregor nodded eagerly, delighted with the unexpected foresight and thrift. In fact, he could have used this surplus to pay off his father's debt to his employer, and the day he could quit his job would have been much closer. But now he was sure it was better the way his father had arranged things. However, there was not nearly enough money for the family to live on the interest. There was perhaps enough for them to live on for a year, 2 years at the most, but no more. So it was just a sum that could not actually be touched, and had to be kept for an emergency. Money to live on would have to be earned. Now, though his father was in good health, he was an old man who had not worked for 5 years. And in any case, he could not be expected to take on very much. Over those 5 years, which had been the first holidays of his hard-working yet unsuccessful life, he had put on a lot of fat, which had made him very ungainly. As for his old mother, who suffered from asthma, for whom it was an effort just to walk around the apartment, who spent every other day lying on the sofa at the open window gasping for breath, was she supposed to go out and earn money? And was his sister supposed to earn a living when at 17 she was still a child, and had so far led a life no one could begrudge her? Dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping in the home, enjoying a few modest pleasures, and above all, playing the violin? Whenever the discussion turned to the need to earn money, the first thing Gregor did was to leave the door and throw himself onto the cool leather sofa beside it, burning with shame and grief. Often he lay there, sleepless through the long nights, just scrabbling at the leather for hours. Or he would make a huge effort to push an armchair up to the window and crawl to the windowsill, prop himself up on a chair, lean against the window looking out, evidently somehow recalling the feeling of liberation this had once given him. For in fact, his sight was deteriorating by the day, and even things no great distance away he could see less and less distinctly, and the hospital opposite he had looked at all too often and cursed the sight of it. That he could not see at all now. If he had not known for certain that he lived in the Charlottenstrasse, which though quiet was right in the middle of the city, he could have believed that from his window he looked out onto a wasteland in which the grey sky and the grey earth merged together indistinguishably. His observant sister only needed to notice twice that the armchair was next to the window. After that, she would carefully push it back to the window every time after clearing up the room. And from now on, she even left the inner windows open. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him, he would have found it easier to accept her help. As it was, however, it pained him. Of course, his sister did everything she could to dispel the embarrassment of it, and indeed, the more time went by, the more she was able to. But in time, Gregor too noticed things more closely. He even dreaded the moment she entered the room. Scarcely had she come in that she would dash straight to the window without even taking time to close the door, however carefully she was at other times to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, hurriedly fling it open, as if she were almost suffocating, and stand there for a time, however cold it was, taking deep breaths. She alarmed Gregor twice a day with all this hurry and bustle. He spent the whole time trembling under the sofa, although he knew very well that she would certainly have been glad to spare him all the upset, if only she could have brought herself to stay in the room as Gregor with the window closed. Once, it must have been a month since Gregor's transformation, when she surely no longer had any reason to be surprised by his appearance. His sister arrived a little earlier than usual, and found Gregor motionless, propped upright, and looking out of the window, a sight to frighten anyone. It would not have surprised Gregor if she had not come in, since, being where he was, he prevented her from opening the window right away. But not only did she not come in, she recoiled and shut the door. The stranger might well have thought Gregor had been lying in wait and was going to bite her. Of course, he immediately hid himself under the sofa, but he had to wait until midday before she came back, and she seemed much more agitated than usual. This made him realize that she still could not bear the sight of him, that she would continue to be unable to, and that she no doubt had to make a great effort not to turn and flee when she saw even the small part of his body that stuck out from under the sofa. One day, in order to spare her too, he dragged the linen cloth on his back from the table to the sofa. This all took him 4 hours, and arranged it so that he was completely covered, and so that his sister could not see him even if she bent down. If she thought this covering was unnecessary, then she could have removed it, for it was clear enough that Gregor did not derive any pleasure from totally isolating himself like this. But she left the cloth where it was, and Gregor once thought he even glimpsed a look of gratitude when he cautiously lifted the cloth a little way with his head to see what his sister thought of the new arrangement. Over the first 2 weeks, his parents could not bring themselves to come into his room, and he often heard them say how much they appreciated the work his sister was doing. whereas before they had frequently got annoyed with her because they regarded her as a rather useless girl. But now they both often waited outside Gregor's room while his sister was tidying it up, and she had scarcely emerged when she had to tell them exactly how the room looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether she might have noticed any slight improvement in his condition. His mother had even wanted to go see him quite early on, but his father and sister dissuaded her with reasonable arguments, which Gregor listened to very carefully and fully approved of. But later, she had to be held back by force, crying, "Let me go and see Gregor, won't you? After all, he's my poor son. Can't you understand? I must see him." On these occasions, Gregor thought it might be a good thing if his mother did come into his room. Not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. After all, she understood things much better than his sister, who, for all her pluck, was only a child, and as a matter of fact, had perhaps only taken on such a difficult task on childish impulse. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon granted. If only out of consideration for his parents, he was reluctant to show himself at the window during daytime, but he could not even crawl very far across the few square yards of floor space. Even during the night, he had trouble lying there quietly. He soon lost his appetite, and no longer took the slightest pleasure in eating, and so, by way of diversion, he took to crawling to and fro over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the ground. He could breathe more easily, felt a gentle swaying sensation through his body, and in the almost blissful state of distraction he experienced up there, he would occasionally, to his own surprise, let go and crash on the floor. But by now, of course, he had more control of his body than before, and did not injure himself even by falling from such a height. His sister at once noticed this new form of amusement Gregor had devised for himself. In fact, in crawling about, he left traces of sticky substance here and there, and so she hit on the idea of giving him more space to crawl about by removing his furniture that was in his way, especially the chest of drawers and the writing table. But she was not able to do this on her own. She did not dare to ask her father for help, and the housemaid would certainly not have helped her. Although this girl of about 16 had bravely stayed on after the previous cook had left, she had asked as a special favour that she might be allowed to keep the kitchen door permanently locked, and have to open it only when specifically required to. So his sister had no choice but to call on her mother while her father was out. Her mother came along with cries of delight and excitement,
Finally,
but fell silent when she reached the door to Gregor's room. His sister, of course, first checked to see that everything in the room was in order, and only then let her mother in. With the greatest haste, Gregor had pulled the cloth even lower, and made more folds in it. Now it really did look just like a cloth that had been thrown casually over the sofa. This time, Gregor also refrained from peeping out from under the cloth. He fortified the chance of seeing his mother on this occasion, and was simply glad that she had come in at last. "Come in. He's nowhere to be seen," said his sister, evidently leading her mother by the hand. Then Gregor heard the two women struggling to lift the old chest of drawers, which was heavy enough, while all the time his sister took on most of the work without listening to her mother's warnings not to strain herself. It took them a very long time. They must have been at it for a quarter of an hour when his mother said they had to leave the chest where it was. Firstly, because it was too heavy for them to be finished before her husband arrived, and if they left it in the middle of the room, it would block Gregor's way completely. And secondly, it was not all that certain that they were doing him a favour by taking the furniture out. She seemed rather to think the opposite. Her heart sank when she saw the bare wall, and why shouldn't Gregor feel that way too? After all, he'd gotten used to the furniture in his room long since, and would feel isolated if it were empty. "And anyway," his mother concluded in a hushed voice, not knowing exactly where Gregor was hiding. She generally spoke in an almost whisper, and she did not want him to hear the sound of her voice, for she was convinced he could not understand what they said. "If we took the furniture away, wouldn't it look as if we'd given up all hope of recovery, and were cruelly abandoning him? I think it would be best if we tried to leave the room exactly as it was before, so that when Gregor comes back to us, he'll find everything unchanged, and it would be all the easier for him to forget what had happened in the meantime." When Gregor heard his mother's words, he realized that the absence of all direct human contact in the course of these 2 months, combined with his monotonous life at home, must have confused his mind. Had he really wished to have his warm, cozy room with its comfortable family furniture turned into a cave in which he would be able to crawl about wherever he wanted, but at the cost of completely forgetting his previous existence as a human being? Indeed, was he even now so close to forgetting it that only his mother's voice, which he had not heard for so long, had jolted him out of the idea? No. Nothing must be removed. Everything must stay. He could not do without the comfort presence of the furniture. And if it stopped his senseless crawling about, then so much the better. Unfortunately, though, his sister thought otherwise. In a discussion about Gregor with her parents, she had become accustomed, not without justification it must be said, to act as the expert in the matter. So on this occasion too, her mother's advice was sufficient to make her insist on clearing out not only the chest of drawers and the desk, which was all she had intended at first, but also all the other furniture, with the exception of the indispensable sofa. To be sure, it was not just the childish defiance and the hard-won self-confidence she had recently acquired so unexpectedly that prompted her to insist on this. She had also noticed that Gregor did, in fact, need a lot of room to crawl about. While so far as she could see, he did not use the furniture at all. But perhaps it was also the over-eager imagination of girls her age, which seizes every opportunity to indulge itself, that now tempted Greta to see Gregor's situation in yet more lurid terms, so that she could do even more for him than she had hitherto. For surely no one else would ever venture to set foot in the room where Gregor, and Gregor alone, had the freedom of the empty walls. And so she refused to be persuaded otherwise by her mother, who, in any case, seemed agitated and unsure herself in this room. She soon fell silent and gave her daughter what help she could to move the chest of drawers out of there. Well, Gregor could do without the chest of drawers in a pinch, but then the desk had to stay. And scarcely had the two women got the chest of drawers out of the room, groaning as they heaved at it, than Gregor poked his head out from under the sofa to see how he could intervene as discreetly and considerately as possible. But unfortunately, it happened to be his mother who came in first, while Greta was in the room holding the sofa with both arms, rocking it to and fro on her own, without, of course, managing to move it an inch. But his mother was not used to the sight of Gregor. It might have made her ill, so he hurriedly retreated to the other end of the sofa, but could not prevent the front of the cloth moving slightly, which was enough to catch his mother's eye. She stopped, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greta. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing out of the ordinary was happening, it was just a few pieces of furniture being moved around. All the same, he soon had to admit to himself that all this coming and going by the women, the brief instructions they addressed to each other, and the scraping of the furniture across the floor, caused a great commotion all around him.
Bend to the knees. Lift.
And however tightly he drew in his hind legs and pressed his body against the floor, he was forced to conclude that he could not stand it all for very long.
It's so heavy.
They were clearing out his
It's
room,
so heavy.
taking away everything he cherished. They had already taken the chest of drawers containing his fret saw and other tools. Now they were heaving the desk that seemed to have grown into the floor. The desk at which he had written his assignments when he was first at business school, at secondary school, even at his primary school. And now, he simply had no more time to weigh up the good intentions of the two women. Besides, he'd almost forgotten about them, for in their exhaustion, they were now working in silence, and all that could be heard was the weary tread of their feet. So he emerged from his hiding place. The women were leaning against the desk in the next room to recover their breath, and ran, this way and that, changing directions 4 times. He had really no idea what to say first. Then the picture of the lady, swathed in furs, hanging on the otherwise empty wall, caught his attention. He quickly crawled up to it, and pressed himself against the glass, which held him firmly, and soothed his burning underbelly. His body covered the whole picture. At least no one would remove the picture now, for sure. He swiveled his head towards the living room door, in order to watch the women as they returned. They had not allowed themselves much of a rest, and were coming back already. Greta had put her arm around her mother, and was almost carrying her. "What shall we take now, then?" said Greta, looking around. Then her eyes met Gregor's on the wall. It was probably only because her mother was there that she kept her composure. She bent her face down close to her mother's to prevent her from looking round, and without thinking, said in a tremulous voice, "Come on, let's go back to the living room for a moment, shall we?" Her intention was quite clear to Gregor. She wanted to get her mother safely out of the way and then shoo him down off the wall. Well, just let her try. He was sitting on his picture, and he wasn't giving up. He would rather jump out at Greta's face. But Greta's words had only unsettled her mother, who stepped away, caught sight of the huge brown blob on the flowered wallpaper, and, before she had actually realized that it was Gregor she was looking at, cried, "Oh God! Oh God!" in a loud, hoarse scream, fell onto the sofa with outstretched arms, as if giving up completely, and lay there, motionless. "Gregor, you!" cried his sister, glaring at him and raising her fists. These were the first words she had addressed to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the next room to fetch some smelling salts to rouse up her mother from her swoon. Gregor wanted to help too. There was still time to save the picture. But he was stuck fast to the glass, and had to use force to free himself. And then he too ran into the next room, as if he could give his sister some advice as he had done in the past. But then he had to stand helplessly behind her while she rummaged about among various small bottles, and they gave her a fright when she turned around. One of the bottles fell and smashed to bits. A splinter of glass hurt Gregor in the face, and some kind of caustic medicine spilled all over him. Then Greta hurriedly seized as many bottles as she could carry and ran to her mother with them, slamming the door shut with her foot. Now Gregor was shut off from his mother, who, through his fault, was perhaps close to death. He could not open the door, for fear of driving away his sister, who had to stay with her mother. There was nothing he could do now but wait. Overwhelmed by remorse and anxiety, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, the walls, the furniture, the ceiling, and finally, in his desperation, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell onto the middle of the big table. For a while, Gregor lay there exhausted. It was quiet everywhere. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The maid had, of course, locked herself in the kitchen, so Greta had to open the door. His father was back. "What has happened?" were his first words. Greta's face must have told him everything. She answered in a muffled voice. Her face was evidently buried in her father's chest.
Mother has fainted, but she's better now. Gregor has got out.
"I knew it," said her father. "I always said so, but you women wouldn't listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had misinterpreted Greta's all-too-brief explanation and had assumed that he had committed some act of violence. So Gregor now had to try to pacify his father, for he had neither the time nor the ability to explain the situation to him. He fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that as soon as his father came in from the hall, he would see Gregor had very intention of returning to his room at once, and that there was no need to chase him back in there. He only had to open the door, and Gregor would disappear immediately. But his father was in no mood to appreciate such niceties. "Aha!" he shouted at the moment he came in, as if he were furious and pleased at the same time. Gregor withdrew his head from the door, and lifted it almost towards his father. He really had never imagined his father as he was standing there now. To be sure, he had recently been so absorbed in his new ways of crawling about that he had not bothered to follow what was going on in the rest of the apartment as he had done before. And he really ought to have been prepared to find that things had changed. Even so, was this his father? The same man who had before lain exhausted, buried his head when Gregor had set out on a business trip, who had greeted him from an armchair in his dressing gown on the evening he returned, who had not been properly able to get up, but simply raised his arms to express delight, who, during the rare walks they had taken on few Sundays, and on main holidays of the year, had always struggled along between Gregor and his mother, who themselves walked slowly enough, but even more slowly than they did. Bundled up in his old overcoat, always curiously feeling his way with his walking stick, who, whenever he wanted to say something, almost always stopped and gathered his companions around him. But now he held himself quite upright, dressed in a close-fitting blue uniform with gold buttons, as worn by messengers in a bank. His strong double chin protruded high above the stiff collar of his jacket. His dark eyes gazed out keenly and alertly from under his bushy eyebrows, and his white hair, unkept before, now glistened, combed into a miraculously neat parting. He threw his cap with his golden monogram, possibly that of a bank, in an arc right across the room onto the sofa, and thrusting his hands into his trouser pockets, and tucking the tails of his long uniform jacket behind him, he advanced on Gregor with a fierce expression on his face. Perhaps he did not know what he intended to do. At any rate, he lifted his feet extraordinarily high, and Gregor wondered at the huge size of the soles of his boots. But he did not stop to look, for he had known from the very start of his new life that his father believed that he had to treat Gregor only with the utmost severity. So he ran ahead of his father, stopped where his father paused, and hurried out again the moment his father moved. They circled the room several times like this, without anything decisive happening. Indeed, it all took place so slowly that it did not look as if Gregor were being pursued. So for the time being, he stayed on the floor, especially as he feared his father might regard it as particularly bad behaviour if he sought to escape by crawling up the walls or onto the ceiling. At the same time, Gregor had to admit that he could not even keep up this form of progress for long. For while his father had to take one step, he had to make countless movements. He soon noticed he was short of breath. Indeed, even in his earlier days, his lungs had not been very robust. As he staggered along, gathering all his strength in order to run, he could hardly keep his eyes open. In his sluggish state, he could think of no other way of escape than to run. He had almost forgotten by now that he could take to the walls, even though they were cluttered with carefully carved pieces of furniture, full of sharp points and spikes. Then something, thrown with no great force, narrowly missed him and rolled away in front of him. It was an apple, quickly followed by another. Gregor stopped in terror. There was no point in running. His father had decided to bombard him. He filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and without taking careful aim for the moment, was throwing one apple after another. The small red apples rolled about on the floor as if they were charged with electricity, bumping into one another. One, thrown freely, grazed Gregor's back, but glanced off harmlessly. But another followed immediately, and actually embedded itself in his back. Gregor tried to drag himself onwards, as if the unexpected, unbelievable pain might pass with a change of location. But he felt as if he were nailed to the spot, and lay stretched out, his senses reeling. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being flung open, and his mother rushing out in her shift, followed by his sister, who was screaming. She had undressed her mother so that she could breathe more freely after she fainted. Then his mother rushed over to his father, her unfastened petticoats slipping to the floor, one after the other. And stumbling over her underskirts, she threw herself at him and embraced him, wholly united with him. Gregor's sight was already failing now,
Don't kill
and grasping his father's head in her hands, begged him
Don't
to
kill him.
spare Gregor's life.
Please don't kill him. Please don't kill him. Please
Thank
don't
you
kill
so
him.
very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, share, all that jazz. And if you really enjoyed, do subscribe because there is more to come. That has taken me an hour and a half to record. I don't know how long the edited thing is going to be. I imagine shorter than the first chapter, but still, it's taken me an hour and a half to record. Editing's going to take a full day. Editing's going to take a full day. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you're listening to a podcast, please leave a review. Please share it as gets in front of as many people as possible, which is great. And I love reading your reviews. They're like a little boost of joy when I get to read your positive reviews. If you want to support the show further, you can donate to the show using Ko-Fi. You can leave a super thanks here on YouTube as another way to donate, as I've got to pay for drama school, and I also have to pay rent and food and all of those awful things that we have to do to live in a modern world. But once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.